Welcome to the Expert Speaker Podcast. We have living legend, Shannon Graham. Welcome to the Expert Speaker Podcast, Shannon.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I first heard about you in the Archangel group. I think it was back in 2016, and I saw a Forbes article that says this guy made $1 million coaching. And I was still struggling to make $100,000. And I thought, who is this guy? And we got on the phone, and you were so generous to share what seemed like magic to me, charging over $100,000 per client. And what I've noticed over the years is that you make the impossible possible for your clients, for yourself, and whether you want to start a t-shirt business and just go without anybody's permission, or whether you want to send a mastermind of entrepreneurs into outer space, nothing seems outside of your realm of possibility. So I'm excited to connect with you, and what I think my audience will be delighted to learn from you is, one is, how did you ever figure out how to charge high prices for coaching? And how do you think about making the impossible possible for your clients and breaking into entirely new businesses for yourself?
Yeah, all great topics to talk about today.
And if I'm not mistaken, you started in the world of modeling in New York City. You want to take us back to those days and what you learned from that?
Well, that was an interesting time as well. That was a very short period of time. That was less than 12 months. I'm originally from Vermont, and I had a friend who did some modeling in the city, and connected me to one of his people. And I lived in that world for a very short amount of time, but it taught me something very valuable, which was, I had a friend in the city during that time, and he looked similar to me, tall, dark features, and him and I struggled to get work. And he had a friend from his hometown that came, and he was blonde and blue-eyed, and he got more work than he could handle. And so in that season, blonde hair and blue eyes was kind of the look. And I remember my grandfather, when I was young, always used to say to never allow your success to be determined by other people. And so, we would show up to these calls and we would give it the best that we had, but we just weren't the look for that season. And, a couple seasons later, tall, dark featured guys was like, that was the thing. And so that period of my life kind of was a great teacher, in that it reminded me that if I really wanted to be in control of my destiny and my financial reality and all of those things, then that was something that I should not leave up to other people.
Don't let other people determine your success.
Yeah.
And then you got into the coaching business. And
that's right.
Knowing what I know about charging six figures for coaching, I assume you're pretty good at coaching, but I know you're very good at marketing and selling coaching.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. If we determine good as in your ability to receive this large sum of money from a client.
Yes.
So how did you become so good?
Well, there's a couple layers to that. The first is that I got really good at understanding the luxury market. There's people who spend $10,000 or $20,000 on a handbag. There's people who spend $100,000 or more on a watch. There's people who spend $1 million on a car. So that's a very different mindset from most people. And what that tells us is that there are groups of people who think about spending money and that have a relationship to money that is different from everybody else. And Whereas most of the population would look at $1 million car and think that either that's ridiculous or it's just so far out of their reality that it just doesn't make any sense. There's someone who's looking at that going, yeah, I'd like to have that. And not only would I like to have that, but I feel like my money would be better spent. It would be better for me to spend that money and have that car than to keep the money. So someone is choosing that reality, which is pretty wild. And so that, in conjunction with finding out that, Tony Robbins, for his private coaching, his private one-on-one coaching, is $1 million plus 20% of, the upside. Now it's Tony, so he can pretty much command whatever he wants. But the fact that people were actually paying it really put things in perspective for me. So I said to myself, if Tony can do 1 million plus 20%, I think I can do 150. And as long as I position it correctly, as long as I package it correctly, and as long as I communicate the value of it correctly, as they say, the right message to the right person at the right time. And I found that to be true.
Do you remember the first time you got $150,000 client and how it felt?
Oh yeah, very much so. I was actually chatting with him today. Him and I, we worked together in a coaching capacity for 3 years, because that's the agreement for the coaching program, is 36 months. But as you can imagine, after you work with people for that amount of time, that intensely, they very much feel like family long after you are not officially working with them anymore. So we talk all the time. But yes, I remember being on the phone with him, and I had made a big decision that I was going to go all in on this 6-figure price tag, which meant I made an agreement with myself that I wasn't going to offer any lower price points. It's kind of like Bugatti doesn't offer a $50,000 model of their car. They don't even offer a $500,000 version of their car. It's either like you play up here or not at all. And so I really wanted to take a stand for me expanding my capacity to receive, which is another piece of the equation that I'll get to in a minute. And also, just like there was an identity shift as well, because when you play at that level, it is a different identity from a coaching perspective. And it was a different identity from a coaching perspective for me, mostly from the terms of, historically, I got paid for my knowledge and my experience. That's what people hired me for, because my background is in athletics. I did athletics to a very high degree for a long time. So I understand peak performance very well. And high-level founders, high-level executives, peak performance is very important for them, because if they can perform at their peak, then it improves the bottom line. Everybody wins. So I did that for a long time. But I wouldn't say that it was my genius or that it was my gift. My gift is really my creativity and my imagination. So in certain moments of my life, I simply give myself permission to wipe the slate completely clean and imagine something completely new. So I said, okay, well, I don't want to get paid for my knowledge and my experience, because A, they're limited, and B, I want to increase the amount of money that I can make. And if the amount of money I make is in direct proportion to the value that I create, then my knowledge and my experience are limited. I also want to make a bigger impact. And I can only make a certain degree of impact with my knowledge and my experience. So what if I got paid for something else? What if I got paid for my creativity and my imagination? What if I got paid to be asked questions that I didn't know the answers to? Now that's a huge, we could talk for the rest of the day about that, because most people predicate their value in life on what they know or what they can do. That's kind of how, as a society, we determine how valuable someone is like how much do you know? Like, how much school have you gone to? a doctor went to 8 years of school and they get paid more compared to someone who went to 4 years of school. So it's a very kind of linear knowledge-based value system. And it's totally broken because it's not necessarily completely accurate to creating value, because your imagination and your creativity are both unlimited, and the possibility for value creation from that standpoint is actually way higher than any knowledge or experience that you could have. So I started to lean into that. And I remember being on that very first call with him, and when it was time to say the price for the investment of the program, I was like going back and forth in my mind, and like just matrix speed back and forth of like, should I say the actual price? It's probably too high. He's not going to go for it. If I say this lower price, he'll probably go for it. And on top of that, I had said no to 5 other people that week who wanted to pay me $6,000 for this old program that I, like I said, put my flag in the ground and said, I am this person now. I am going to stand for this. So it's like I already felt in a way like, oh man, I already turned down all this money. What if I make the offer and he says no? And in a millisecond, I remember thinking to myself, it's better to say what you genuinely want and not get it, than say what you think you could probably get it and not feel like you truly asked for what you wanted. And so I remember just saying it's 150,000. And he paused, and in those types of situations, a second is like an eternity. And he said, well, I paid more for my house than that, and the return on investment for this will be way more. I'm in. And the rest is history, as they say.
And so is that 150 for all 3 years, or is it 150 per year?
Per year.
And did you have any experience getting a 3-year commitment from anyone before?
No. The reason is that, so a lot of the success in my enrollment comes from my ability to do a lot of homework and a lot of work on the front end before I even get into what I would call an enrollment conversation. So I'm optimizing for the highest probability that they're going to say yes to a 36-month commitment. And I can base that on a number of kind of filters that I can put them through before we even get on the phone. That lends itself to zero resistance from that standpoint, because everything is relative. 36 months in the coaching industry to most people sounds like absolutely crazy, but so does doing the impossible, so does charging 150,000, so does like a number of things, until you put that type of offer in front of a particular type of person. Like buying a Bugatti sounds absolutely asinine to 99.99999% of the entire population. Like it either doesn't make sense or it's just not possible. But you put it in front of that one person and they're like, yeah, that's awesome. Here's the money. That sounds great. So 36 months relative to someone who is a visionary, that amount of time is not that much. And so, and they understand that. So that's what makes that work.
And those 5 other people you were who wanted your $6,000 program, did you offer them the 150 36 month, or you didn't even offer it because it's not really a fit?
No, because my older programs were essentially like Toyotas or Hondas. And so those were very much like Honda buyers. That would be like offering a Ferrari to a Honda buyer. Like it didn't make sense.
Got it. And since you've now had many large clients like this one, what have you seen is the customer journey that leads up to them having this conversation? For example, I often will speak at an event or do a webinar, and people might, read my book or watch some social media videos, and then they get on a call with me. They're decently familiar with my work, or at least that's there's going to be a higher likelihood of them buying, if the more familiar they are with my work. So what have you found has been like how they discover you and what the relationship buildup is up into that conversation, the enrollment conversation?
Yeah, the biggest channel, I guess you could say, that people come to me is just word of mouth. Um, Word of mouth to this day is still the best business building strategy. The biggest companies in the world, the majority of their profit comes from word of mouth. Apple is the example I use all the time. They're the world's first $1 trillion company. They're also the world's first $3 trillion company. They spend very, very, very little on advertising at the end of the day. Word of mouth is where they get the majority of their new business. Tesla is the first US $1 trillion car company, which is insane to think about considering how long they've been around compared to like Ford or GM or those other guys. And they spend like practically zero on advertising. All of their business comes from word of mouth. And so that's typically the sign that you're doing something right. So most of it comes from word of mouth. If it doesn't come from word of mouth, people will either see me speak on stage. I also have a social media strategy, I suppose, that is a sequence of posts that I do that lead up to an offer. You've seen that legacy offer a few times, I imagine. There's always a sequence of posts that happen before that to build context and to build some framework around that offer so that when that offer goes out, people are more leaning into me and my thought leadership and stuff like that. So that's been pretty effective as well.
When you were talking about Tesla and Apple, I was thinking those products are so good they sell themselves.
Yeah.
And their founders are obsessed with making the product better, not making the marketing better.
Right.
And so what do you consider the product? Is it your coaching? Is it your program? Is it the combination of the client's implementation and their results? And if you said to yourself, all right, I want to make my product better.
Yeah.
What do you do?
So that's a great question. A lot of that comes down to my ability to be a great coach. And my ability to be a great coach comes down to my ability to grow myself. And so I'm constantly looking at new and different ways to improve myself so that the amount of value that I have to bring to the table. Let's say I never change the coaching program at all. It's one phone call a week, one quarterly in-person meeting with me, and then access to me via text throughout the week. That's it. And let's say I never change that. If I change myself, if every year I'm very adamant about going deep on some area of my own improvement, then the ROI that I can bring to the table within that same frame becomes better year after year after year. And so that's a huge component of the ROI.
Got it. You're deepening your own growth accelerates the ROI.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, a coach is as good as their ability to produce results. And producing results as a coach really comes down to a handful of qualities. For example, like listening and asking good questions. But there's a big, like if you listen to a newbie coach ask a question, they'll likely ask a question based on the words that they're hearing the other person say. An expert coach will hear beneath or between the words and ask a question that goes a couple layers deeper and therefore kind of prompts a better response. So there are things you can do to become more masterful at listening. And everything that entails being a good listener, like being present. things like that. So it's really just about reverse engineering that end outcome and looking at how much of that is within my control as far as who I am and what I can bring to the table, and what are the areas where I can make improvements on that for myself, so that when I show up to a call, I have more to bring to the table, or I am more to bring to the table.
Hmm. Hmm. Cool. I'd love to hear about your venture into the t-shirt business.
Well, so that also brings us back to New York City.
Mm.
The my agent, when I was in the fashion world, had a t-shirt business, and you might remember it. It was pretty famous in the fashion world for a while. It was the t-shirt that said, "Please don't feed the models."
Hmm. Hmm.
That shirt was like a sensation for a hot minute, and I was on his team to help with sales and creative ideas for shirts. I love being in the creative process. My brain just operates that way, whether I like it or not. And so I'm just always thinking about creative ideas. And so that was just a fun outlet to do it. Fast forward a number of years, I found myself one day just randomly thinking about ideas for t-shirts. And I had this idea to take culturally negative statements and somehow flip them into positive statements.
Mm.
And we live in a day and age where you can go from idea to like actually tangibly able to roll that idea out pretty much in like less than 24 hours.
Yeah.
T-shirt business is a great example. Like there's websites and apps now where, if anyone watching this wanted to start a t-shirt business, you could literally do it by the end of the day. You could probably do it within a couple of hours at this point.
Yeah.
So that's a beautiful thing. You can be a visionary, and you don't have to have all the resources. And I remember being in my agent's apartment, and he just had like machinery and like printing materials and like just all this stuff you had to have in order to make t-shirts back in those days. Like that was just part of it. And none of that exists anymore. You literally can just like simply have it all exist up here, and the computer will do the rest.
Hmm.
And so I really like that. So I had a few ideas for shirts that I ended up printing, and really it was kind of like Kanye in the way that like Kanye kind of to a degree just made the clothing that he wanted to wear. Um, I just wanted to have my own clothing line for myself in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
and it just so happened that other people liked it. Um, so I think that's a good point to touch on, because I think a lot of people would wait or hold off on doing some type of project like that until some particular moment of like, well, once I make $1 million, or once I reach this certain level of success with my other business. And that's not necessarily a bad way to think about it, because sometimes timing does make sense. For example, Elon sold PayPal and then did Tesla and SpaceX. So there was an order and a sequence to the thing. Um, but I think of it more so as like, I never made that t-shirt brand to make a lot of money. I did it more so just as a form of self-expression.
Hmm.
And I think that that's the big key, is like there's probably a lot of things that people want to do in their life in relation to self-expression that they don't do because they think that maybe they're not successful enough, or they think that they have to wait for a number of reasons. Um, but if it has more to do with self-expression than anything else, then that's something that you can do now.
Hmm.
And so I just got into the habit of like, yeah, just do it now. Um, and the cool thing about having coaching practice that has very few moving parts and no big team and like not a lot of ad spend and all of that, the profit margins are very high. So when you make a decent amount of money, you actually keep a decent amount of money. And I remember I was at Tom Bilyeu's house, and he was talking about like what, he sold Quest for $1 billion, and I can't remember how much he walked away with at the end, but it was like easily hundreds of millions. And he was like, yeah, once you have like all your basic needs met and all of the, like you buy a couple fun toys and things like that. He was like, for guys like us, it's really just about building. Like you can just use money to do fun, creative shit. And if it makes money, that's cool. And if it doesn't make money, that's cool. And I remember he made a comic book with Steve Aoki, and I was like, the entrepreneur in me was like, that's so dumb. Like, that's not going to make money. Like, why? What a waste. And then I saw how much joy it brought him. He was like a fucking kid in a candy shop. And I was like, oh, I get it. Like, instantly, it was like, it's not about that at all. It's just about the fact that he had a fun idea. He had a buddy that he wanted to do it with, and they did it, and it was fun. And that's a cool thing to do with your money. And so I was like, right. So yeah, it serves you well to create a life and a business where you have time and space so that you can work on fun projects when they come up.
You don't have to wait until you're a millionaire to have fun and do the fun projects. You can do it now, and you can do it just because it's fun and creative.
Yeah, completely. And especially because like when you look at people's effectiveness, a lot of people would be like, oh, well, dude, I just don't have the time for that. It's like, well, if we really put your day under the microscope and looked at what are the real needle moving activities that are driving progress and revenue at the end of the day, it's less than 20% of what most people are doing. Like 80-20 principle doesn't even apply. It's less than 20%. And so it's like, no, you got the time. You're just like obsessed with what I call creative avoidance, which is like being busy for the sake of being busy, which there's no point. So there's a lot of freedom in understanding that and realizing like, no, you can still like have a really successful business, and you can still, I'll never forget, I heard Jack Dorsey, while he was still at Twitter, he had this rule that he was home for dinner every single night with his family. That was like a thing. And, guys at not even a fraction of his success will work, 12, 13 hours a day and say that they can't make it home to dinner for this, that, and the other reason. And here's Jack Dorsey, someone who's wildly more successfully and potentially way more busy than them, but chooses not to be. And so, yeah, it's pretty much all available as long as you create a mindset that supports it.
Mm-hmm. And now you're in the space business. You're bringing people to outer space. So what inspired that?
Well, I've always been a bit of a closet space nerd. So there's that. The second part goes back to what I mentioned as far as like being a visionary these days is easier than it's ever been. Because technology allows for things to move forward so quickly. And we've evolved from a business consciousness standpoint. So like, for example, you have Uber, which is over $1 billion company. They don't own any of their own assets. You have Airbnb, which is $1 billion company. They don't own any property, which is wild. Facebook is technically a media company that they don't create any media. So you have all these wildly successful companies these days that don't own any of their own assets, which is just wild to think about. Like that 20 years ago, like that wouldn't even be possible. And so we just live in a different day and age. And when I looked at the space industry, this was 2021. it was the year that Inspiration 4 went up. It was also the year that Jeff Bezos went up, Richard Branson went up, and William Shatner went up. And so it was like this monumental year for civilian space travel. And if you know anything about the law of diffusion of innovation, in the beginning of any new thing in the marketplace, not a lot of people want to be a part of it. The iPhone, for example, every single person in the freaking world has an iPhone now. But when it first came out, nobody actually wanted it because it didn't have buttons. It had like apps. It was weird. Nobody really understood what it was about. But the innovators, the people who are like on the bleeding edge of innovation, they were like, oh, damn, the iPhone is like going to be the thing. And so we see that across the board with every single new technology to come to the market. The automobile, people had perfectly working horses and buggies. They were like, what's wrong with the horse and buggy? It works fine. We've been doing it for hundreds of years. There's no need for this automobile. Well, now everybody has an automobile. Elon was like, yeah, electric cars. They were like, we kind of tried it with the Prius, didn't really work. Electric cars, not really feasible. Now Tesla is the most valuable car company in the world. And pretty much all the other car companies are going electric, not for no reason. So I was like, oh, civilian space travel is going to be a thing. Mm-hmm. Because not only does everything like take a little while in the beginning to take off, and then like once enough, it's called the tipping point. Once you reach about 15% market penetration of any new idea or technology, that 15% is usually what is the differentiating factor that gets like the entire rest of the marketplace. So with that entire rest of the marketplace usually comes democratization. So space travel right now is really kind of like a rich man's game. You know, it's like only wealthy people are going to space because it's expensive. The people who can afford to go are going, but that leaves a whole lot of other people. Well, technology is rapidly expanding. So the cost of going to space is coming down very quickly, which means in the near future, the idea of like going to space or like going to the moon for a weekend vacation will be financially the equivalent of like, do you want to go to Paris for the weekend? You know, like it'll be that easy to make the decision financially. So I was like, oh, okay. So space is going to be a thing, but there's a little piece here that nobody's paying attention to. You have two worlds within the space community right now. You have what I would call like the commercial side or the exploration side, which is more like NASA and SpaceX to a degree, which is like, what's out there? How far can we go? You know, can we learn about these other things? It's really about science. It's about learning. It's about discovery. It's about pushing the boundaries in those ways. And then you have this new vertical, which is like space tourism, which is kind of like, okay, you've done everything that there is to do. What do you get the guy who has everything? Well, you get him a trip to space because he's never been to space. So that's cool. It's kind of a new and different thing to add to the list of things that human beings have the option to do. But there's this interesting phenomenon that happens when you go to space and you see the Earth from space. And it's called the overview effect. And it was coined by a friend of mine named Frank White many, many years ago. And basically, when you go to space and you see the Earth from space, there's this transformative phenomenon that happens. And it's because you see the Earth without borders and you see it without boundaries. And what it reminds you is that we're just one human race. There's no race, there's no borders, there's no boundaries. All of that stuff is literally made up. And you see Earth against this backdrop of vast nothingness, which reminds us that as of right now, Earth is the only home that we have. And our current cohabitation is not a successful one. We are currently extracting resources faster than the Earth can replenish them. So that's any system that is not self-sustaining is by definition self-terminating. So it's problematic. So all like 630 or so people who have been to space so far, all of them report having this experience. So that's pretty wild when you think about it, because I don't know of any like technology that has an 100% success rate. That's pretty impressive. My follow-up question is, okay, all of these people are having this experience. In my world, it's the name of the game is integration. Okay, you went to Tony Robbins and you got your mind blown, then what? Okay, you had an ayahuasca session and you had a conversation with God. Cool, now what? How do you tangibly, specifically walk that out to equal impact in the world? Because at the end of the day, that's what I'm most obsessed with. And after a very short amount of time, I came to the conclusion that no one is focused on long-term impact as far as taking the magic that happens from the overview effect and crystallizing it down into tangible impact. And I am uniquely qualified to do that. So I basically created a space agency that focuses entirely on giving the overview effect to visionary leaders who already have a strong desire to make the world a better place, and simply integrating the overview effect into their ability to create impact in the world.
Amazing. So you're flying when?
2026. There will be a group of 8 of us going. There's currently 5 people signed up.
So you just call up the rocket company and say, book me a flight up.
Exactly.
They have customs or like military clearance? Like, do you have to?
Nope. So that's kind of the cool thing about it. That's the cool thing and the tricky thing about it, because the FAA has to be involved because that's just part of it. Because the FAA has to be involved, because it's so new, the safety components are tricky. But to your point, as of right now, I have relationships with most of the biggest space providers in the world. And so none of them are approaching space travel the way that I am. So we are synergistic together and not competitive. So they're happy to kind of be teamed up in that way. So essentially I just call them up and say, hey, I've got 8 people that we're going to take on a voyage. And similar to Uber and Airbnb, they've built out all the assets. They've spent the time and money and resources on developing the technology. I simply get to utilize it in a way that it's not being utilized.
And what did you choose for the price to go to space?
Well, as of today, the current price is $150,000, and that is for the initial group of 8, because it's a very unique person that wants to go on this mission. I'll just say that it's a very unique person, and so I want to kind of like prove the concept first. I want to do it with this first group of 8 people, because then I think it'll be a little bit of its own tipping point. Other entrepreneurs and other visionaries will kind of see this thing happen and go, wow. There's in the law of diffusion of innovation, there's this group that is very close to being the innovators, but they're just not quite willing to be the first people to go. But they watch those first people very closely. And as soon as those first people do it, and give the thumbs up, immediately they follow. And
Mhm.
so my thinking is that this first 8 will allow those who are right on the verge to raise their hand and say, okay, I'm in. And then after that, it's an avalanche.
Cool. So I'll ask you another pricing question.
Mhm.
For the coach or the consultant or the entrepreneur who maybe wants to have a higher priced offer, but has some belief that they can't, um, what advice do you give in terms of pricing? And how do you choose the number? Why 150, not 200, not 100, not 250?
Yeah. Well, so there's a couple factors there. Um, the first factor, if you're thinking about it logistically, is simply like, let's say you have a coaching business or a coaching practice, and you want to do really high level one-on-one. The question is, do you want to do that in conjunction with some things that you're already doing? So, like, you have an online course, you have a group program, you have a product, you have a mastermind, you have a whatever. Do you want to kind of bolt this on? If so, great. Then what is your capacity, right? How many of those people do you have the capacity to work with? And how much revenue do you want that to be responsible for? So once you reverse engineer some of those things, then it can help give you some clarity on that. The other side of that coin is there are some people like myself who are like, no, fuck all that other stuff. I just want to do high end one-on-one and that's it, period. Great. What is the annual or monthly revenue you want to create from that? And what is your capacity as far as those levels of clients? Because it's a totally different game when you work with people at that level. Even though you're only working with them once a week, the energy, the presence, the stakes, the expectations, they're all higher. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does call you to a higher game for sure. So whereas, some people might be like, well, I work with 15 clients a week or whatever. You, I'm not saying you couldn't do that, but it would be more challenging to do that at the higher level. So again, it just comes back to what's the revenue you want to create? What is your capacity for that? For me, it's 7 people. 7 people is my max. So I said, okay, well, I want to make $1 million a year. Divide that by 7. It's just a little over 150. So 150.
Mhm.
So there's just some kind of helpful ways that you can look at the mathematics to help you figure it out.
Got it. All right. Well, we've covered a lot. We've covered creativity and pricing and what it takes to be a great coach. One thing I want to acknowledge and maybe glean some wisdom from is I noticed you put on a lot of muscle. Saw a lot of pictures of you in the gym, and then you were looking like a tank by the end of all those gym pictures.
Yeah.
What was the inspiration from that? What did you learn from that? And how has that changed your experience?
Yeah, great question. So I have this exercise that I do called the future self. And it's a technique I came up with, like, gosh, probably like 20 years ago, where I essentially consult with my future self. So, what I do is I visualize myself sitting across from myself. But
Hmm.
the self that I'm sitting across from is the future version of me that is living in the reality that I want to live in, whether that's financially or relationship or health and fitness or whatever. I usually combined all of them because life doesn't exist in compartments, So it would usually be like all of them together. Boom, here's this guy. And every single time when I would sit down with this guy, I would purposely do it so that the chair was empty at first, and he would walk into the room and sit down because I wanted to pick up on the nuances of like the mannerisms and how does he walk and some of those things. But every single time he came into the picture, he was this like bigger guy.
Mm.
And I was like, wow, my self-image is different than my actual current physiology. And I liked the idea of being bigger. I've been lifting weights for a long time. I've been lifting weights since I was, my mom worked 3 jobs back in the day. She was a single mom, so she wouldn't pick me up from school at the end of the day. But the school had a gym, and they kind of my school was unique in that they kind of just let kids hang out after school, because there was just a number of kids that it was probably better for them to just hang out at school than go get into trouble.
Mhm.
So I would just work out. And I thought that was like the coolest thing. Like I had access to this awesome gym. So I've been lifting weights for a long time, but my physique more or less stayed the same. And I remember one time having this conversation with this guy and saying, what's the difference between you and me? And obviously, like there's a size difference, but like in here, what's the difference? And he said, your identity is that you're a guy who works out.
Mm,
My identity is that I am an athlete.
mm,
And it was like the light bulb went off. That future self exercise, I'm telling you, so much of my success has come from that, because it's like you have this secret access to somebody who has all the answers. It's like, oh, when it comes to like financial reality, like, okay, I just got this chunk of money. What would you do with it? And he's like, well, I would do this and this. And the old me would do something like vastly different and probably less intelligent. So I've been able to glean so much wisdom from that. But I'll never forget, he said, I'm an athlete. And it hit me like, yeah, I would go to the gym 5 days a week and I would kind of like go through the motions to maintain a certain level of health and physique. But an athlete is different, aren't they? An athlete trains. They don't work out, they train. And when you train, there's always a purpose to the training. If you are an athlete, under the motto of the original Greek Olympics back in the day, which is higher, faster, stronger. So if you competed back in the day, the entire year leading up to the competition, you would train to be able to jump higher, lift more weight, and run faster. There was always an objective. There was always a point. You were always trying to get higher in some way. That was a game changer. And it was an identity rather than something that I engaged with and then didn't. It was like, no, this is who I am. And that identity also forced me to look at things like my nutrition, because Olympic athletes, I think Phelps, when he was at the top of his game, especially during competition, he was eating, I can't remember, but it was like ungodly. It was like over 5,000 calories a day or something like that.
mm,
And I was like, oh yeah, that's a part of it too. So I completely shifted the way I thought about myself in relation to working out. And I approached it with this athlete identity of like, not only this is who I am, but I'm training for a purpose. I'm training, there's something that I'm working towards rather than just a hamster wheel of like just kind of doing the same thing and maintaining a certain level of health. And by the way, for those of you listening at home, there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's totally great. If you get healthy and stay healthy, like that's awesome. I just had a different objective. And so I completely changed how I showed up to that. I started lifting significantly heavier. I started eating significantly more. I started taking recovery way more seriously. And that over the span of about 24 months, I put on about 45 pounds. And what I noticed is that people started to respond to me differently.
mm,
And certainly there was an energy, right? Like when you put in that level of dedication and commitment, and showing up when you don't want to show up, and eating the extra calories, and making sure you're getting good sleep, and really lifting like you mean it, your energy is different. You show up different. And so there is a magnetism, there is a charisma that comes with that. And then there is just the fact that physically you are bigger and people just respond to you different. Like you and I talked recently, and I said, who is the biggest action star of the 90s? Arnold Schwarzenegger. Is it a coincidence that he was larger than life? Not even close. Who's the current highest paid actor in Hollywood? Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. He has no acting background. Arguably, some people would say the wrestling community is very much an acting background. That's a debate for another time. But, compared to like Clooney and like real vanguard, like Hollywood, people, it's because he's huge. And so there is very much something to it. People do respond to you differently. And it's been interesting to watch because, as you know, I have not always been this way. And so I've seen both sides of the fence in how people kind of perceive and react to me differently. It's fascinating, really.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing. I've got a question I've never asked you after all these years, and I'm curious your answer. I take a lot of, I'm very intentional with who I make my friends.
Mm-hmm.
And it comes from moving to different schools every year. I was always moving as a kid. And my dad always told me, you're the average of the people you spend the most time with.
Yeah.
And the time that I met you, I was stretching to buy into that mastermind called Archangel. And I was certain I was the least successful person there, and someone would find out that I'm an imposter and I'm around all these people I had on pedestals. And I'm still a member of Archangel, and I still invest heavily into masterminds from a business perspective. And socially, I seem to have so many friends. I'm just also very aware, and still, I'm going to be like the people I spend the most time with. And I wonder what Shannon Graham does in terms of friends and how you figure social life, social network, and who you let in and who you don't let in, because you have such a cultivated elite mindset and habits. And my guess is you probably don't surround yourself with people whose habits you don't really want to replicate. So anything you want to share about who you keep in your company?
Yeah. So I was at Ty Lopez's house a number of years ago, and we were talking about this exact topic. Because as you can imagine, Ty Lopez, there's a lot of people who want to be his friend. There's not as many people who want to be my friend simply because I'm just not as well known as he is. But the practical application is the same. Because he was standing next to me and he watched some guy come up to me and ask me a few questions. And the questions were just not the type of questions that I was interested in having a conversation about. And so I just very kind of politely but abruptly put an end to that. And the guy just kind of walked away, and Ty turned to me and he said, "I saw what you did there." And he said, I have a word for what I call it in my world now, which is reciprocal altruism. He said, if a relationship doesn't feel like reciprocal altruism, then I don't want anything to do with it. And that's an interesting concept because synergy is different depending on what season of life you're in. So like most entrepreneurs only want to be around other entrepreneurs because they speak the language. Financially, it's kind of a different reality, et cetera, et cetera. But sometimes it's more of like reciprocal altruism can also be like character. Is this like a good person? Is this someone that there's like this synergy and being around in their being? So you have to get really clear about like what season of life you're in as far as what you want to receive from the people that you're around. The other thing that you have to remember is that you are affecting the 5 people that you're around as well. So what is it that because you have to think of yourself like a gift, especially if you're going to give 5 people this immense gift of your presence and your time, your knowledge, your insight, your experience, your creativity, your all of those things. That's a gift. And so like, what is it that you want to bring to the table? And when you bring a gift to someone, ideally you want that gift to be as well received as possible. Okay, so if I have this gift that is me that I want to bring to the table, I want to bring that to a person who can appreciate it the most. Because I want to feel appreciated. We all do when it comes to any type of relationship. But also it helps with the reciprocal altruism. It helps with the synergy of that relationship because they get the benefit of actually being able to soak up whatever it is that you're bringing to the table, and vice versa. So that creates for a very powerful relationship. So I am very much in that mindset of like, well, not only what am I getting, but what am I bringing to the table? And depending on what season of life I'm in, I'm asking myself, what is it that I'm really wanting to get out of a friendship or a relationship at this point? And so that kind of helps with that as far as how I think about it.
Cool. Yeah. Think of yourself as the gift. Consider who's so lucky to receive the gift, and consider how well received you are as a gift.
Yeah, I think we're all selfish by nature, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that sometimes it can get in our own way to forget that, like, it's like, well, which mastermind can I get in so that I can get the most out of it? And like, what friends can I connect with that are going to benefit me the most? It's like, those are good questions to ask. The opposite side of that coin is like, what are you bringing to them? What are they getting from you? The masterminds, if you go all the way back in time, the original masterminds were created by people who had vastly different professions. And they were able to come together and pool their expertise so that they could all get better multidimensionally in different ways. So it was very much valuable to bring different types of people together. And what you see these days very often in masterminds is a lot of the same people hanging out together, which birds of a feather tend to flock together. There's nothing wrong with that. But from an engineering standpoint, from a synergy standpoint, if you're not bringing something different to the table, then it tends to stagnate. And then the mastermind tends to relegate itself to like more of a like party / kind of like hangout type of thing, which again is not necessarily bad. It just depends on what is the intention, what's the end goal for the thing. If I'm wanting my end goal to be a improvement in some way, then simultaneously I should be thinking about what's the improvement that the people that are also going to be with me in this friend group, in this mastermind, in this whatever, what is it that they're going to receive as well? That's a question that most people don't ask that I think is important to ask.
Yeah. Speaking of questions that are important to ask, Shannon, are there any questions I didn't ask as we start to wrap up?
I think you did a fantastic job. No,
I love hearing your wisdom. Where can people connect with you to stay connected?
Instagram. Instagram is a great place.
All right. Shannon Graham on Instagram. Thank you for joining us on the Expert Speaker Podcast, Shannon.
Oh, thank you for having me.